The phone erupted violently into the stillness of the night, yanking me from a deep slumber. My room, cloaked in darkness, felt as if it were closing in on me as I fumbled to locate the vibrating device on my nightstand. It was 3 a.m. No one calls at this hour unless it's something serious or worse. The name that lit up the screen sent an icy shiver coursing through me. Asterisk, asterisk, Clara, asterisk, asterisk. For a moment, I hesitated, staring at the illuminated letters, my confusion mingling with anxiety. Why was she reaching out to me? This was unusual, and a nagging feeling warned me that answering would set off something irreversible. Yet I couldn't let it ring. Something about this felt significant. Hello. My voice was hoarse, still heavy with sleep for a moment. All I could hear was her breathing, soft but uneven, like she was grappling with what to say. You should have been here. Clara's voice was barely above a whisper, yet it sliced through the silence like a blade. What do you mean? What's happening? I sat up, fully alert now. My heart raced as my mind scrambled for answers, but nothing added up. Why was she calling me at such an hour? Why did her voice sound so desperate? She didn't reply. A long, uncomfortable pause stretched out, the weight of her silence pressing down on me, as if she expected me to grasp something I couldn't yet comprehend. Clara, what are you talking about? Then she hung up. I sat there, staring at my phone, my heart pounding in my chest. The stillness of the room amplified the turmoil in my mind. Her words, they weren't random. There was something deeper, something I hadn't yet perceived. But whatever it was, I sensed my life had just been thrown off course, with no chance of turning back. The next morning, I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling left by Clara's late-night call. I kept replaying her words in my mind, trying to decipher their meaning, but they only added to my confusion. What did she mean by, "You should have been here"? Where was here? The questions nagged at me all day, like an itch I couldn't scratch as I struggled to clear my mind. I decided to go to the supermarket, thinking a touch of normalcy might help me push those thoughts aside. I wandered aimlessly through the aisles, grabbing a few items I didn't even need. I almost convinced myself that the call had been some strange mistake when I spotted her. Clara, standing by the fresh produce. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't expected to see her, especially not so soon after that bizarre phone call. Yet she seemed different. There was something off about her demeanor. Her usually confident posture appeared tense, and her eyes darted around the store as if she were searching for someone or something. When she finally caught sight of me, her face softened for a fleeting moment, as if relieved to find me there. But then her expression changed again, becoming guarded and unreadable. "You're here," she said, her voice soft but firm. I nodded, unsure how to respond. "Yeah, just picking up a few things." My words felt empty, as if I were trying too hard to make this encounter feel ordinary. Clara stepped closer, glancing around quickly to ensure no one was watching. "We need to talk," she said, her tone serious. "Not here. Outside." Before I could respond, she turned and headed for the exit. I stood frozen for a moment, my mind racing. There was something about her urgency that made it clear this wasn't just a casual chat. I followed her outside, where she waited by the side of the building, away from prying eyes. Her arms were crossed, and she appeared to be wrestling with something internally. I could see it in the way her jaw clenched, the way she avoided my gaze. "What's going on, Clara?" I asked, striving to keep my voice steady. She finally met my eyes, searching mine as if assessing how much I knew and how much I could bear. "You've noticed it, haven't you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Things between us, they've changed." Later that evening, Clara insisted we meet. She selected a small, dimly lit coffee shop on the outskirts of town, a place where people go when they want to remain unseen. I sat by the window, watching cars pass by, trying to prepare myself for what she might say. My thoughts kept drifting back to her earlier words about how things between us had shifted. I wasn't sure what she meant, but I knew it couldn't be good. When Clara arrived, she slid into the seat across from me with quiet, deliberate grace. She looked exhausted, as if she hadn't slept since the previous night, but her expression was calm and focused for a brief moment. Neither of us spoke. The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken thoughts. "Thanks for coming," she finally said, her voice low but steady. She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup without taking a sip, as if holding on to it was the only thing keeping her grounded. I nodded, uncertain how to initiate this conversation. "What's going on, Clara? You've been acting differently." She let out a soft sigh, her eyes dropping to the table. "I don't know how to explain it," she murmured, almost to herself. "I didn't expect any of this." "Any of what?" I pressed, leaning forward to meet her gaze. The unease in my stomach had only intensified since the supermarket, and I needed clarity. "You're not making sense," I said. She looked up, and for the first time, I noticed something in her eyes that surprised me: vulnerability. It was so out of character for her that I was at a loss for how to respond. Clara had always exuded confidence and composure, yet here she was, struggling to find the right words. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she said quietly. Her voice barely broke through the hum of the coffee shop, but I could feel it. Something was amiss. Lately, I had sensed a stirring within me, something that shouldn't exist. Her words lingered in the air, quickening my heartbeat. I recognized where this conversation was headed, even if I was reluctant to admit it. A tightening sensation gripped my chest as the truth washed over me. "Clara," I started, but she interrupted me. "Just hear me out," she urged, a note of frustration creeping into her tone. "I'm not sure when it began, but I can't ignore it any longer. I know you feel it too." I froze in my seat. The room felt constricted, the air dense. I tried to push away the thoughts that had been swirling in my mind for weeks, but now, facing Clara, I realized I could no longer hide from the truth. "This isn't right," I said, my voice quivering. "You're married to my father." "I know," she replied softly, her eyes filled with an emotion I couldn't quite define. Guilt? Regret? Perhaps even sorrow? "I understand it's wrong, but I can't pretend I don't feel this." I stared at her, my thoughts racing. The weight of her admission felt suffocating, making it hard to breathe. I had sensed the shift, the stolen glances, the electric tension. But I had buried those feelings deep, convincing myself they were inconsequential. Now, with her confession hanging between us, I could no longer ignore the reality. "We have to put a stop to this," I said, though I wasn't sure if I was trying to convince her or myself. She nodded slowly, yet her eyes conveyed a different story. "I'm not sure we can." After that moment of honesty, we sat in silence, which felt like an eternity, the weight of everything pressing down on us. The once inviting coffee shop now felt stifling. Every sound, the clatter of cups, the murmur of voices, seemed amplified, more intrusive. I couldn't bear to stay there any longer. I needed space to think and breathe. "I'll give you a ride home," I declared, more as a statement than a question. Clara didn't argue. She merely nodded, her expression unreadable, and followed me out into the cool night air. The drive felt like a journey into a void, and the silence stretched painfully between us. I gripped the steering wheel too tightly, my mind spinning with everything she had just confessed. I couldn't fathom how we had ended up here, where clarity seemed a distant memory. Every turn felt like a misstep. Clara sat beside me, her gaze lost in the passing scenery, her face dimly illuminated by the streetlights. She seemed far away, absorbed in her thoughts, yet I felt her presence more than ever. The tension crackled between us, like a live wire neither of us could control. Eventually, the silence became unbearable. I cleared my throat, unsure of how to breach the growing chasm between us. "Clara, this isn't right. You know that." Her gaze remained fixed ahead, but I noticed her fingers twisting the fabric of her coat in agitation. "I know," she whispered, her voice barely above a murmur. "But that doesn't change anything." I pressed down harder on the accelerator, the car picking up speed. "We can't continue like this. It'll ruin everything." She turned to me, her eyes dark and intense. "Do you honestly believe it hasn't already?" Her words struck me like a blow. She was right. The moment we acknowledged the tension simmering between us, things had begun to unravel. There was no going back now, not really. The damage was done. Even if we tried to pretend otherwise. Clara, we must end this. I insisted again, though the words felt empty, as if I were trying to convince myself more than her. This can't go any further. For what felt like an eternity, she didn't respond, just looked at me with an expression that was equal parts resignation and something I couldn't pinpoint. Do you really think we have a choice? I struggled to answer that. A part of me wanted to believe we could walk away from this, that it wasn't too late to make things right. Yet deep down I knew she was right. We had crossed a line. Even if we stopped now, nothing would ever return to the way it was. We drove on in silence once more, the road stretching endlessly before us. The headlights cast long shadows on the trees lining the street, and the hum of the car was the only sound that filled the void between us. I felt the weight of her presence beside me, the pull of everything left unsaid. But I couldn't find the words to breach that silence. As we neared her home, Clara shifted in her seat. "You don't have to come in," she said softly, almost as if she wanted to spare me the awkwardness that was about to unfold. But as I pulled up to the curb, I realized that wasn't what I wanted. "No," I replied, surprising myself with the firmness of my tone. "We need to discuss this. We have to figure out what comes next." Clara regarded me for a long moment, her eyes searching mine as if gauging my sincerity. With a slight nod, she opened the car door and stepped out. I followed, the cold night air hitting me like a jolt as I closed the door behind me. The following day, I felt an urgent need to escape, to clear my mind, to find a place where I could think without the weight of everything pressing down on me. I decided to visit the museum, hoping the quiet halls and timeless art would provide a welcome distraction. As I walked through those galleries, surrounded by centuries-old masterpieces, I thought it might help me gain some perspective on the chaos I had stumbled into. But life doesn't grant you reprieves when you need them most. It was in the heart of the Renaissance wing that I spotted Clara again. She stood alone before a painting, staring at it with an intensity that made me uneasy. I hadn't expected to encounter her here. I hadn't even entertained the possibility. We had crossed paths outside of the tangled mess we were caught in. I hesitated for a brief moment, contemplating fleeing before she noticed me, but it was too late. She glanced over her shoulder, saw me, and offered a small, almost imperceptible nod. I sighed inwardly, realizing there was no escaping this encounter. I approached her slowly, my footsteps echoing in the empty gallery until I stood beside her. We remained silent for a time, gazing at the painting before us. A serene landscape that felt worlds away from the turmoil brewing in our lives. "I didn't expect to see you here," Clara said quietly, breaking the silence that hung between us. "I needed some space," I admitted, still avoiding her gaze. "I thought being here might help clear my head." She nodded as if she understood completely. "Same here, but it seems like we're both trapped in this mess, no matter where we go." I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I kept my eyes locked on the painting, hoping it would provide the answers I sought, but it didn't. Nothing could undo what had already begun. "Why are you here, Clara?" I finally asked, turning to face her. My voice came out softer than I intended, but her vulnerability made everything feel painfully real. She hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor, her shoulders sagging under the weight of unspoken words. After what felt like an eternity, she whispered, "I didn't want it to be like this." I almost missed her words. They were so quiet. "But I can't stop thinking about you." I tried to ignore it, to pretend it wasn't happening, but I can't anymore. "And I know you feel it too." Her admission struck me harder than I anticipated. Deep down, I had known this moment was inevitable, but hearing her voice those thoughts made them feel all the more real. My chest constricted, and for a fleeting moment, I struggled to catch my breath. "Clara?" I began, unsure how to articulate the whirlwind of emotions surging through me. "We can't do this. You know that." She met my gaze, her eyes filled with a tumult of emotions: regret, longing, fear. I know it's wrong, she said, her voice trembling, but that doesn't change how I feel. I swallowed hard, my mind racing with the implications of everything that had transpired and everything that lay ahead. We can't. This will ruin everything. She shook her head, her expression torn between desperation and sorrow. It's already too late. Can't you see? We crossed that line the moment we acknowledged that this was more than just a fleeting thought. My heart raced, and I was at a loss for words. She was right. As much as I wanted to cling to the hope that we could return to how things were before, I knew there was no erasing what had already been said and felt. The damage had been done. Taking a deep breath, I shifted my gaze back to the painting before us. Its serene beauty felt tainted by the tempest raging in my mind. So what happens now? I asked. Clara didn't respond immediately. She turned her eyes back to the artwork, her lips pressed into a thin line. I don't know, she finally said, her voice barely audible. But whatever happens, we can't pretend this isn't real. We can't keep lying to ourselves. Her words hung in the air, and I felt their weight settle heavily in my chest. There was no turning back. We were too far gone, and the path ahead was fraught with uncertainty. I wanted to tell her that we could find a way out, that we could stop before things escalated further, but I knew that would be a lie. I could feel the truth in her words, the same truth I had been trying to avoid for so long. That night, sleep eluded me. My mind was restless, replaying the events of the past few days on a continuous loop. Clara's words echoed in my thoughts. It's already too late. Can't you see? She was right. There was no denying that this was no longer a fleeting feeling. Yet, I couldn't shake the guilt, the sense that each step we took pulled us deeper into a situation we couldn't control. Around midnight, unable to endure the suffocating silence of my home any longer, I left. The streets were quiet and deserted. I drove aimlessly, unsure of my destination, until I found myself at a small park, one of those hidden spots that rarely saw visitors, especially at this hour. The air was cool, and the stars shone brightly, their light cutting through the sharpness of the night. I parked the car and strolled along the winding path, seeking clarity in the stillness. I hadn't anticipated seeing her there. Clara sat on one of the old wooden benches, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the streetlights. She didn't seem surprised to see me. If anything, she looked like she had been waiting for my arrival. I hesitated, torn between approaching her or turning back, but before I could decide, she spoke. I couldn't stay at home, she said softly, her eyes locked onto mine. I needed to get out. I needed space. I nodded, understanding without needing to voice it. I sat down beside her, the cool wood of the bench pressing uncomfortably against my back. We sat in silence, listening to the rustle of leaves in the trees and the distant hum of the city, both lost in our thoughts. The park felt like the last remnant of a world where time had stopped, where everything else faded into the background. Do you ever feel trapped? She asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Her voice was quiet, almost fragile, as if she were afraid to voice her thoughts. I looked at her, searching for the emotions on her face, but all I could see was exhaustion. Yeah, I admitted, more than I want to acknowledge. She let out a small sigh, her shoulders slumping as if carrying the weight of the world. I don't know how we got here, she said, her voice wavering, but I can't continue like this. It's too much. I nodded, though I was at a loss for words. Every word felt weighted, almost perilous. Yet, I could sense the tension between us intensifying with each passing moment of silence. The darkness and tranquility of the park made everything feel more profound, more authentic. I wish things were different, I finally said, my voice barely rising above a whisper. She turned to me, her eyes reflecting that same mix of emotions I had noticed in the museum. Fear, sadness, longing. Do you? She asked, her tone soft but pointed. Do you really wish things were different? I opened my mouth to respond, but no words emerged. The truth was, I didn't know. A part of me wished we hadn't crossed this line, that we could return to pretending everything was fine. But another part of me, The part one had been suppressing for so long was reluctant to change. That part craved this connection. Craved her. I don't know, I admitted, my voice cracking under the weight of my confusion. I just don't know what I want anymore. Clara looked away, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. I don't either, she said softly. But what I do know is that I can't keep pretending. Not anymore. The silence thickened between us, pulling us closer together like gravity. It was the same feeling I had been trying to ignore for weeks. But now, sitting in the dark park, I could no longer deny it. We were past the point of no return. What are we going to do? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Clara turned back to me, her eyes searching mine as if seeking answers we both lacked. I don't know, she replied softly. But whatever happens next, we can't keep lying to ourselves. Her words lingered in the air, their weight settling heavily in my chest. There was no easy way out of this. No matter what we chose, someone was going to get hurt. Yet, despite the fear and guilt, a part of me was reluctant to let go, a part that couldn't. I wish things were different, I repeated, though this time the words felt empty. I knew wishing wouldn't alter reality. The damage had already been inflicted. Clara leaned back against the bench, gazing up at the sky. Maybe in another life, she mused quietly, almost to herself. Maybe in another life, things could have been different. I didn't know how to respond to that. All I understood was that we were trapped in a situation we couldn't escape. And no matter how much we longed to, there was no turning back. The park fell silent again, the stillness nearly unbearable. I could hear my heartbeat echoing in my ears, the only reminder that time continued to move, even if we felt frozen in this moment. I'm scared, Clara admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. So am I replied. We sat in silence for what felt like an eternity, merely existing in the space between our desires and the reality we faced. As the night stretched on, I realized just how lost we both were. The days following that night in the park blurred together. I tried to concentrate on anything but Clara, work, chores, mindless distractions, but nothing stuck. Every thought inevitably circled back to her, to the words we had exchanged and those we had left unspoken. A sense of inevitability hung in the air, as if something unavoidable was looming. It was a Thursday evening when the ground beneath me finally gave way. I had just returned home from work to an unusually quiet house. My dad's car wasn't in the driveway, and for a brief moment, I allowed myself to believe I'd have some time alone to think. But as soon as I stepped inside, I felt the tension saturating the air, thick and suffocating. Clara stood in the living room, her back to me, staring out the window. Her shoulders were tense, her body rigid, as if she were bracing for impact. I hesitated, unsure if I should speak, but before I could gather my thoughts, she turned to face me. Her complexion was pale, and her eyes were wide with a blend of fear and resignation. He knows, she said quietly, her voice trembling just enough for me to catch it. My heart sank. What? Your dad? I asked, bewildered. He knows about us. The room spun around me, and I had to grip the back of a chair to steady myself. What do you mean he knows? How could he? Clara swallowed hard, crossing her arms tightly over her chest as if to hold herself together. I don't know how, but he confronted me this morning before he left. He didn't say much, but the way he looked at me, it was like he had already pieced everything together. I felt as if the floor had dropped out from beneath me. I had sensed this moment coming. Deep down, I had always known, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real. It made everything feel irrevocably tangible. He didn't say anything to me? I muttered, more to myself than to her, my mind racing. I saw him last night, and he didn't even hint at anything. Clara shook her head, her eyes a swirling mix of guilt and relief. He didn't say anything to me either. He just looked at me like he already knew everything. I tried to process her words, but my thoughts tangled together in a chaotic mix of fear, anger, and guilt. What are we going to do? I don't know, she said, her voice trembling with uncertainty. The weight of her admission settled over me like a heavy shroud. There was no easy way out of this mess we had created. And now that my dad knew, or at least suspected, everything, there was no escaping the fallout. I sank onto the edge of the couch, running my hands through my hair in frustration as I grappled with the reality of our situation. "He's going to hate me," I murmured, almost as if saying it aloud would make it any less true. "He's going to hate both of us." Clara didn't respond. She didn't need to. The truth was already palpable between us, lingering like a thick fog. We had crossed an unbridgeable line, and now we had to face the consequences. The front door creaked open, followed by the sound of footsteps echoing down the hallway. My heart raced as my dad stepped into the living room, still in his work clothes, looking tired and worn. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes quickly scanned the room, first landing on Clara and then resting on me. The silence stretched uncomfortably, thickening the air around us. "I think we need to talk," my dad finally said, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of tension. He didn't take a seat. Instead, he stood with his arms crossed over his chest, waiting for us to respond. Clara shot me a glance, her eyes pleading for guidance, but I was at a loss for words. I had envisioned this confrontation countless times, yet now that it was real, I felt utterly unprepared. My dad let out a deep sigh, shaking his head in disappointment. "I don't know what's been happening between you two, but I'm not blind. I've noticed the way you look at each other. I've seen how you've both been acting, and I won't pretend that I haven't been suspicious for a while." My heart sank. I opened my mouth to protest, to explain, to apologize, anything, but no sound emerged. All the excuses I had rehearsed felt hollow and inadequate. "I trusted both of you," my dad continued, his voice heavy with hurt. "I expected you to be honest with me, but it seems that was too much to ask." "I'm sorry," I blurted out, the words spilling from my lips before I could think. "I didn't want this to happen, I swear." For a brief moment, his expression softened, but then he shook his head. "You didn't want it to happen, but it did. Now we have to deal with the aftermath." Clara remained silent, her face pale and her hands trembling. I could see the tears threatening to spill over, but she fought to keep herself together. "What now?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. My dad didn't answer immediately. He stood there, staring at the floor as if grappling with the weight of the situation. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he finally spoke. "I don't know," he admitted quietly. "I need time to process this and figure out what it means for all of us." He turned and walked out of the room, leaving Clara and me in stunned silence. The gravity of his words hung heavily between us. I looked over at Clara, but she was staring at the floor, her hands still shaking. "What do we do now?" I asked, my voice barely audible. She shook her head, tears glistening in her eyes. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, I felt completely adrift. The house felt colder after my dad left, as if all the warmth had been sucked out, leaving only an oppressive chill behind. Clara and I stood there in the suffocating silence, neither of us knowing how to begin to fix what was broken. I could still hear my dad's words echoing in my mind, the disappointment, the betrayal cutting deeper than I had anticipated. He hadn't yelled or raised his voice. He didn't need to. It was the silence that felt like a weight pressing down on me. His gaze had held a mixture of hurt and confusion, as if we were strangers he didn't recognize. I hadn't just broken his trust. I had shattered something fundamental between us that might never heal. Clara moved first, breaking the stillness. She wiped a tear from her cheek, her hand shaking as she fought to regain her composure. "I should go," she whispered, her voice fragile. "I can't stay here. Not like this." I didn't stop her. I couldn't find the words. There was nothing left to say that could make this right. I watched as she turned toward the door, each step slow and heavy, the weight of the moment stretching out like an eternity. Just as she reached for the doorknob, she hesitated, her hand hovering for a moment. I wanted to say something, anything, but my throat was dry, and my heart raced painfully in my chest. She turned to face me, our eyes locking in a moment that felt suspended in time. "Do you think we could have been different? Do you think we could have been different?" she asked softly, her voice quaking with uncertainty. Her question landed like a punch to the gut. I found myself at a loss for words. Could we have changed our course? Could we have stopped this before it spiraled out of control and crossed lines we shouldn't have crossed? Or was this all an inevitability, a slow-motion disaster we were powerless to prevent? "I don't know," I finally whispered, feeling hollow inside. The room fell into an unbearable silence, as if the house itself were holding its breath, waiting for something to shatter the tension. Clara held my gaze for what felt like an eternity, her eyes searching for something. An answer, a glimmer of hope. But I had nothing to offer her. "I never intended for any of this to happen," she said, her voice breaking. "But now, I don't even know who I am anymore." I opened my mouth to respond, to tell her that I felt equally lost, that I was just as ensnared in this mess as she was. But before I could say anything, the front door creaked open, and my dad stepped back into the room. The sight of him standing there in the doorway hit me like a cold wave. His eyes flickered between Clara and me, but there was something different in his expression now, something deeper than disappointment or anger, twisted my stomach with dread. He remained silent for a moment, his face hard to read. His quiet presence felt even more suffocating than before. Then, in a voice that was unnaturally calm, he said, "I've made a decision." The words hung heavily in the air, ominous and foreboding. My heart raced, and I braced myself for whatever was coming next. I glanced at Clara, but she stood frozen, her eyes wide with fear, waiting for the inevitable blow. But what he said next caught me completely off guard. "You both need to leave," my dad declared, his voice steady and final. "I can't have either of you here anymore." For a moment, time seemed to freeze. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt the color drain from my face. Both of us? I wasn't sure I had heard him right. Was he kicking me out too? "What?" I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. "You heard me," he replied, his eyes cold and distant. "I can't deal with this. Not with you, not with her. I need both of you gone." Clara's face crumpled as the weight of his words sank in. She took a shaky step toward him, her voice trembling. "Please, I don't—" But he cut her off, his tone sharp. "Don't make this harder than it already is. Just go." I could see the pain etched into every line of her face, the way her shoulders sagged under the force of his rejection. She didn't argue or beg. She simply nodded, her expression pale as she turned toward the door. I wanted to speak up, to defend myself, to ask why he was including me in this. But the words wouldn't come. Nothing I said could change his mind or undo the damage already done. Clara left first, her footsteps echoing in the silence as she walked out into the cold night. I stood there, frozen, my mind racing. My dad watched her leave, his expression unreadable, before finally turning to me. "You have until tomorrow to pack your things," he said quietly, sadness lacing his voice in a way that cut deeper than any anger could. I stared at him, the reality of the situation slowly dawning on me. I was being exiled from the only home I had ever known, from the life I had built. And for what? For a mistake I wasn't even sure how to comprehend anymore. As my dad turned and walked away, leaving me alone in the empty room, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had lost more than just my home. I had lost everything. My family, my trust, my sense of self. As I stood there, staring at the closed door, one question echoed in my mind, growing louder with each passing second. Could things have been different? The silence that followed was deafening.